Thank you everyone for coming to Firebox this evening. As you can see, we're getting everything together slowly but surely. Well, we've only been open for 3 weeks actually, and we've had a load of really brilliant events so far. If you're interested in holding an event here or a breakfast meeting or anything, please do speak to Claire afterwards. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I just want to let you know about some upcoming events that we have. Next Wednesday on 31st, we've got a Halloween special with Lindsay German, who will be speaking on look at the persecution of witches and the treatment of how the treatment of women intersected with the persecution of witches. So it's rather confusingly titled Which Witch is Which. So please come along to that. And then on the Thursday, the day after, at 6:30 for a 7 PM start, again we've got Jeremy Corbyn introducing a discussion on the US presidential elections. So again, not to be missed. So now for tonight's speaker, we've got Seaumus Milne. He's an associate editor of the Guardian newspaper and a columnist. He's the author of The Enemy Within and also The Revenge of History, which he will be introducing to us this evening. And it's available at the back and at all good bookstores. So Seaumus.
Thanks very much, and thanks for coming tonight. Thanks for inviting me. If it's okay with you, I'll stay sitting because I've had a bit of an unfortunate accident today. I had a head-on collision with the wife of a Tory MP, and the car that I was driving was written off, so I'm a bit shaky. So if I see my mind wandering at all, that's the reason. Now I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas and the themes that are in the book that has just been mentioned, The Revenge of History. And the book is basically, you could say it's an alternative history of the first decade of the 21st century. I mean, it includes material especially from 9/11 to the Arab uprisings, but there's some before and after that as well. And when we were trying to work out what to call the book, and I was going through this material, I was realizing that, you know, on all the major controversies of this period, on all the great issues of our era, we've been proved right and the other side has been proved wrong. So we thought of calling the book We Were Right About Everything, but then maybe that seemed a little bit over the top, so I went for something different. But I think from the point of view of the left and progressive politics in particular, there are very important lessons from that and strength that we should draw from this period and what we've been saying throughout this period, because I don't regard political journalism as a sort of an individual act. It's not just my opinions that I'm writing in The Guardian or many of you are writing elsewhere. It's about a collective view that is arrived at through collective debate, discussion and collective action. And I hope that I'm able to reflect some of that in what I write. So I mean, first of all, the first decade of this century, the 21st century, has been one that has shaken what was called the New World Order to its foundations and really turned the orthodoxies of the elites on its head. And I think you have to rewind for a bit to the beginning of the 1990s, when we were told that there would be no more social alternatives, that history had actually come to an end, that socialism had died and there would be no more of that kind of stuff, that there was going to be a single power that would dominate the world in a unipolar world, and that would be the United States with its allies, and that there would be a single system of neoliberal capitalism and liberal democracy that would rule. And that was the sense in which history had come to an end. There were no more choices and no more alternative. And that New World Order that was inaugurated with great fanfare after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union by George Bush's father, the then president, that New World Order, I would say, between 9/11 and 2008, crumbled and collapsed. And I would highlight two events in particular in 2008 that encapsulate the collapse of that whole global system, which we've been told would last forever. And there were the two events were, first of all, the Russian-Georgian War of late August of 2008, when, if you remember, it was a small but vicious conflict in which Georgia, which was a client state of the US and had participated very strongly in the occupation of Iraq and was supported by US neoconservatives in particular, attacked Russian troops in the contested area of South Ossetia. And the Russian response was very strong to that attack. And immediately George Bush, backed up by the then British Foreign Secretary David Miliband, denounced it as the most shameless act of aggression, and one that could not go unpunished in the 21st century. This from a guy who had launched the greatest war of aggression in modern American history in the invasion of Iraq. And he said that this would not go unpunished, and that Russia must immediately withdraw, and there must be no question of recognizing South Ossetia's independence. And Russia ignored him and did recognize South Ossetia's independence, and American warships were left sailing aimlessly around the Black Sea. And I think that that event encapsulated the moment when the unipolar world ended. And the second event, barely 3 weeks later, was the better known, if you like, collapse of Lehman Brothers Bank, which triggered the greatest crash and the greatest economic crisis, certainly since the 1930s, if not before, and really fundamentally has broken the neoliberal economy and neoliberal economics that we have lived under throughout the last 30 years in particular. And so, taking that as a starting point, I would like to single out 4 key fundamental shifts that have taken place in that period, in the period really from 2001 to what's called the Arab Spring. And they're all interlinked developments and shifts which have fundamentally changed the world. And I would say in all those cases, in important ways for the better, from the point of view of the people of the world and progressive politics. The first is the demonstration of the limits of American imperial power rather than its extent. And that was the key development that led to the end of the unipolar world. And I think it arose from the incredibly exaggerated and miscalculated reaction of the United States and the neoconservatives to the 9/11 attacks. They turned, the attack on New York and Washington into effectively the most effective terrorist attack in history, because instead of projecting their own power in response to it, by showing that they couldn't impose by force their will on a people prepared to fight back, and that's both in Afghanistan and in Iraq, they demonstrated the limits of their own imperial order and their own strategic power, and it effectively amounted to a strategic defeat for the United States. And the key element, obviously, in that defeat was the resistance, first of the Afghans and even more of the Iraqi people, to that occupation, which of course Britain and many other countries participated in. The second key shift that has taken place in that 10 years, as symbolized and encapsulated by the collapse of Lehman Brothers, is the discrediting of neoliberalism and the neoliberal order. And the impact of this crash and the crisis that it's unleashed, that we're all now living through, has of course been greatest on those economies that bought, or those countries that bought most heavily into the system of deregulated markets, deregulated finance, privatization, and the ballooning inequality and environmental destruction that went with it. And of course, Britain is one of those countries. And at the same time, it's only been through the greatest state intervention in history that an even greater crisis was averted. So in that process, the neoliberal order cracked and the neoliberal ideology was discredited. So I would say that in that period, the sort of baleful twins of neoliberalism and neoconservatism have both been tested and tried and tested to destruction. The third crucial shift of power and fundamental change in the world that we've seen in the last 10 years, and this is going to be a bit more controversial, I think, among a left audience, I would argue, is the rise of China. Now, put on one side for a moment some of the issues around China that are very controversial on the left and among many other people besides, but focus for a second on the fact that in that period, hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty in China, and the gap with the United States, the economic gap with the United States, has been more than halved in less than 10 years. And that has taken place through an economic model which is overwhelmingly driven by state investment. Now, that makes a mockery of neoliberal free market ideology and practice, and it's allowed China to ride out the Western slump throughout those years since the crisis began. And even despite the slowdown, now we're talking about a slowdown to 7.4% of growth or something like that, and made a mockery of the market orthodoxy that's underpinned what we've been living through in the West throughout that period. At the same time, it's created a new centre of power in the world, which has created some counterweight and some space for smaller, less powerful states around the world to have more freedom of manoeuvre and more freedom of action, and at the same time created a motor of growth for the global south. And you just have to look at the huge increase in independent trade between, say, Latin America and China to see that going on. Now, I'm very well aware, obviously, of the high costs and huge qualifications to that point about China. It's huge rise in inequality, corruption, environmental degradation, civil rights, and so on. But I think it's important also to focus on those fundamental changes which have changed the balance of power in the world, and also demonstrated actually the bankruptcy of the neoliberal economic model. And linked to that, the fourth fundamental shift I'd like to highlight in that period is the progressive tide that has swept Latin America throughout the past decade. Now, if you look where that came from, the election of progressive, left, social democratic, more radical socialist governments across the continent and the region of Latin America, it arose from their own earlier experience of neoliberal economics, and it was a particularly grim and destructive experience, starting in Chile in the 1970s, but really coming to its height in the 1980s and 90s in Latin America. And out of that, a new politics emerged, where you've seen these progressive governments, turning their backs on neoliberal economics, taking control of natural resources, nationalizing key parts of the economy, bringing them under collective democratic control, experimenting with new forms of democracy and participation, and crucially, building a new regional integration in Latin America and an independence for the region, really for the first time for 500 years, which is carving out a real centre of independence in the world against United States domination in particular, but also for self-determination for the peoples of the region. And I've just come back from Venezuela a couple of weeks ago, and really, at a time when people are saying the progressive tide in Latin America has come to an end and it's all fizzling out, I can tell you it isn't. I mean, it's not just the very dramatic election victory by Hugo Chavez that took place with, a 55% vote on an 81% turnout after 14 years in power, which really I think anyone would be happy with. But really the fundamental changes, despite huge problems and despite huge qualifications, are really continuing and very impressive, and should be a source of hope for all progressive people, I think, around the world. Now, you could say that the fifth advance, the fifth global shift and key advance in the world since the turn of the century has been the Arab uprisings, and I think that's partly the case, and it's a development that's in progress, but also there are a serious contradictions and qualifications about that, and maybe that's partly another debate. But I mean, of course, there are qualifications on all these points, on all these four fundamental advances that I've outlined. I mean, it's true that the United States has suffered a strategic defeat, but it was a partial defeat in Iraq, which it was able to turn round to some extent through playing the sectarian card. And anyway, the United States and its allies will remain overwhelmingly the most powerful military force in the world, and for the foreseeable future. And of course, the costs of that strategic partial defeat were absolutely horrendous in terms of lives and physical destruction throughout Iraq, Afghanistan, and other parts of the Arab and Muslim world, despite the discrediting of the neoliberal economic model and the breaking of the model in the crisis that we're living through right now. Of course, governments in the Western world are trying to refloat it and rebuild it through austerity and cuts and new waves of privatization that we're seeing at the moment. I mentioned in relation to China the high social costs and environmental costs that are being paid for that success that China's been through, economic success. And of course in Latin America, the oligarchies and elites that have ruled the roost in Latin America until the past 10 years are of course not given up on rebuilding and reasserting their position and using every opportunity to do so. And of course, a couple of years ago in Honduras, they managed to roll back the progressive tide there with a violent coup, which was in effect and in reality backed by the United States, or as Hillary Clinton put it, managed to a successful conclusion. But if you, one of the things, if you look back at this stuff and what's been taking place over this whole decade, as I was doing when I was preparing this book, it's one of the things that's very striking about it is that, you know, what's clear now really, and what's accepted even in the mainstream, really wasn't seen that way at all at the time. In fact, the complete reverse in every sense. I mean, by the end of the decade, where we are now, you know, the global war on terror was so discredited, it had to be renamed by the American government the Overseas Contingency Operations. And, you know, by the end of the decade, Iraq was seen almost universally across the world, including in the United States, as having been an abject and disastrous failure. Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan is seen overwhelmingly as having been a failure for those countries that launched it and have occupied Afghanistan ever since. But you only have to look back at the extraordinary coverage in the media, or what was said by the politicians and the political class in the aftermath of 9/11 in particular, in the run-up to the war in Afghanistan and then in the war in Iraq, to see how far we are from that now. And to go back to that stuff is like being in a sort of parallel universe, a toxic parallel universe. I mean, you know, at the beginning of that period, in the aftermath of 9/11, anyone who questioned, you know, going to war in Afghanistan, or examined what, you know, the reasons for the attacks, in the 9/11 attacks in the United States, or later challenged the drive to war in Iraq, which obviously was much bigger and brought 1 million people onto the streets, was denounced in the most savage terms. And it's like, if you go back to it now, it's hard to believe that these things were said. Not only that they were said, but they were the mainstream in politics and in media coverage. I mean, for example, take a few random examples. You know, The Guardian at that time hosted one of the few real debates about what was taking place in the aftermath of 9/11, and we were denounced by Michael Gove at that time for being a Prada Meinhof group of fifth columnists, and he wasn't joking. I mean, Robert Harris, who was then an intimate of Tony Blair, he later, as anyone who's seen the film The Ghost will know, fell out with him big time. But at that time he was still with the project, and he said that anyone who didn't understand that this was now, that the war on terror was now a replaying of the war against Hitler, and that people who didn't understand this was a war of that kind, that everyone had to come behind, was a traitor or an idiot, a babble of idiots as he called us. Tony Blair at that time, when, you know, as entirely predicted and expected, the Taliban regime was very quickly overthrown by the American and British invasion, declared that all of those of us who had said that war in Afghanistan would lead to disaster, and that and had questioned the dominant interpretation of what had taken place in New York and Washington, said that we'd been proved wrong. And they put out a list, from Downing Street, put out a list at the time of people in the media and politics who'd been proved wrong. And I'm honoured to say that I was one of those people who had been proved wrong, according to Tony Blair. And of course, you know, you only have to fast forward 10 years to see the situation in Afghanistan now, and that everything that not just I, but many, many other people said at the time is complete opposite. It was Tony Blair and his friends who were proved to be utterly wrong, and we who were proved to be entirely right. I mean, you know, for example, Paddy Ashdown, who is considered a great expert on military matters and Afghanistan in particular, as the former viceroy of Bosnia, said, for example, in the dying months of 2001, he said, people who were suggesting that there would be a long-term guerrilla war against NATO occupation of Afghanistan were completely wrong and utterly fanciful. Of course, you know, 10 years later, the guerrilla war against NATO occupation of Afghanistan is at a peak it's never been before, and everyone who said that has been proved to be right. And I'm sure many people here will remember that John Reid, who was British Defence Secretary, a few years later, about 5 years later, said that British troops were being sent to Helmand Province, and he was quite confident that they would leave without a single shot being fired. You know, and as you know, we see today, yet more British soldiers have died for an utterly futile and utterly grim war, and of course many, many thousands more Afghans continue to die as a result of this horrific occupation. Of course, it was the same over Iraq. You know, we were told by Tony Blair that you know, more people, fewer people would die in the British and American attack and occupation of Iraq than would die had died every single year under the rule of Saddam Hussein. And of course, it's the most fantastic and horrific lie. Then, you know, hundreds of thousands of deaths later, that's been obviously no one could take that seriously today. We were told by the American politicians at the time that it was going to be a cakewalk, the invasion of Iraq. Donald Rumsfeld said the war would last 6 days. The entire British media and political class were quite convinced that these diehards and Saddam loyalists would be swept away in a short order. And at the time, you know, I and other people argued that the resistance to foreign military occupation and invasion would last and would continue. Armed resistance would continue until British and American troops were driven out of the country, and that's exactly what happened, but at a huge and terrible cost. But it's not just on the war on terror, or the occupation of Afghanistan, Iraq, or the wider Western wars in the Muslim world that have dominated events over the past decade, where the opponents of the New World Order have been proved right, of course. You know, we were told for 30 years that only the elixir of deregulated markets, deregulated finance, privatization, tax cuts for the rich could deliver a viable and credible economy that would deliver prosperity for people in the modern era. And of course, throughout that period, those people who were attacking that model and arguing that it wasn't delivering for people, the mass of people in the Western world, that actually growth was slower, that working class people in particular, their living standards were stagnating in a way that they hadn't throughout the modern history of capitalism, that it was delivering huge increases in inequality and a huge strengthening of corporate power and massive environmental degradation. Of course, those arguments were made all the time, and those arguments came, of course, from the left, and in particularly from the anti-corporate globalization movement in the early period of the sort of high tide of the neoliberal order. And if you go back and look at which economists predicted and argued that this particular neoliberal model and this particular system of, you know, credit-fueled, finance-driven financialization was going to lead to a crash and a crisis, those economists are overwhelmingly, and maybe this is no great surprise, but it's important to say it, I think, those economists overwhelmingly came from the left. Not only Marxists, but Keynesians, post-Keynesians, but they're overwhelmingly from the left. And all those people, and all of us who argued that, have been proved right. And the elites and the media elites and the political elites throughout the Western world who swore that boom and bust was a thing of the past, that the capitalist trade cycle had somehow been superseded in history in the development of the modern neoliberal economy, that light touch regulation of finance was the only way to go. All three political parties in Britain, they all agreed on light touch regulation, including Vince Cable. They're all on record for it. The only argument was how light the touch should be. And at the end of that, we saw the catastrophe that was unleashed by that system and by that economic model in terms of, destroyed jobs, destroyed lives, slashed living standards, and the crisis that is devastating the Western world in particular, that we're living through right now, in particular in Europe and in Britain, of course. If you go back to what was said about, the liberalization and privatization of the Russian economy and the Eastern European economy in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was said that that was the way to prosperity, this was the way to freedom throughout the Russia and Eastern Europe. And of course, the neoliberal medicine of mass privatization and deregulation led in Russia to the biggest economic collapse in an industrial economy throughout history. And the 130 million people were sent into poverty, and the death rate among Russians escalated catastrophically. And once again, it was the left and progressive people who'd argued that at the time, once again been shown to be right. The same thing can be said about privatization. We argued at the time that privatization, as forced through by the Blair government and Thatcher government before it, of course, but in particular in this period that we're talking about by New Labour and across Europe and other parts of the world, would lead to slashing living standards of workers' living standards in particular, would lead to greater costs, it would cost more, that it would be less transparent, less accountable, and exacerbate the tendency to crisis in the economy. And of course that's been shown to be true. And the same thing is true about the European Union, where neoliberalism is written into the treaties, and as every revision of the European Union treaties has been liberalisation, privatisation, deregulation has been embedded deeper and deeper into the structure of the system, and we argued that that would lead to crisis, and in particular that a lopsided currency union without fiscal transfer mechanisms, without an underlying state structure, and this is the only part of this argument where I'd say that there are people on the right who obviously argued this as well, would lead to disaster, and that is exactly what's now happening in the Eurozone and the horrific crisis that's taking place right now. And that crisis, of course, was triggered by the crash of 2008. So the neoliberal model that was all based on has broken and has collapsed, and the political and economic and business elites who swore that that was the way to go and that was the way to prosperity and success have been, comprehensively discredited, and their arguments have been destroyed, not just by what we said, of course, but by reality. And I think that the crucial point, which I think people on the left need to focus on really, is that the case against neoliberal capitalism and the case against the US-led wars that have dominated the last decade was overwhelmingly made on the left. And it wasn't a coincidence that that was shown to be correct. But whereas the right wing, I would say, in the last generation, have a very well-established habit of crowing and singing the praises of their supposed vindications, real or imagined. The left, for all manner of reasons, I think is rather inclined not to do that. It is not in the crowing business, and has been very slow to capitalize on what has been a gigantic vindication over all the main controversies and all the main disputes of our time, really, in politics and economics. And I think it's important to focus on why that is. And I would say that a crucial reason is that the left has been demoralized and lost confidence, particularly from the very big political defeats that it suffered in the late 20th century, not only in the issues around the collapse of the Soviet Union, but also traditional social democracy, the hollowing out of the labour movement in large parts of the world, and the loss of political confidence and industrial confidence, but also confidence in our own ideas and our own alternatives that encapsulates. And I think that's the that's the main reason why we haven't really been able to capitalize on these, really, which are gigantic vindications of our core arguments. But obviously driving home the lessons of what's taken place in the last decade is essential, not just for the left, of course, but because, as I said a moment ago, these things are being extended and deepened right now, despite what's taken place. So the war on terror, despite the fact that it's discredited, despite the fact that it's been seen to be a failure in Iraq and Afghanistan, has been extended to Pakistan and Somalia and Yemen, in the drone war and other places. The list is long. In Libya, a NATO intervention of a new form, which was supposed to protect civilians, actually increased the death toll in Libya by a factor of between 10 and 20 as a result of the intervention and the air cover given to mass ethnic cleansing on the ground. And anyone who looks at the events in Libya in the last few months can see that far from liberating the country, it's plunged it into a chaotic warlordism and something which has really not given Libyans a chance to determine their own future. We now see the threat of intervention, increased intervention in Syria, and the threat of all-out attack on Iran. So those things haven't gone away. The war on terror hasn't gone away, despite the process that I was describing and the discrediting of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You see even Mitt Romney in the debate with Obama the other night, he said, we don't want any more Afghanistans in Iraq. It shows how deep that process has gone. And if you look at public opinion polls in America, Americans are hostile to these wars. They're hostile to involvement in Libya and Syria. They're hostile, of course, to what's taking place in Iraq and Afghanistan. They don't believe that the United States should be playing the role of world policeman, and yet actually they're not getting much of a say, of course, in the matter. And while neoliberalism as an ideology and as a practice has been discredited, that everyone can see it isn't working, it isn't delivering, it is not delivering growth, it's not delivering living standards, it's not delivering jobs, it's delivering massive rising inequality. Despite all those things, of course, throughout the Western world, Europe in particular, governments are using the crisis to try and refloat the package and the model through austerity cuts and privatization. So obviously being right isn't enough. And what's needed is the political and social pressure to turn the tables of power. But I think there's a lot that we can also draw confidence from that's happened since the crash, since 2008 in particular. That the revulsion against the political and business elites has grown massively. In Britain in particular, we've seen the discrediting of one establishment group after another in one political crisis after another, from MPs in the parliamentary expenses scandal to the police to the bankers, obviously, and the media over one crisis after another. At the same time, we've seen really a significant upsurge in protests, strikes, electoral upheavals across the Western world, and I think they show that the pressure for change, for fundamental change, has clearly begun. We've had the Occupy movement, the inspiration of the Arab uprising. Class politics is back in a very obvious way, even in the United States, and support for the radical left is growing spasmodically but very clearly across the European Union. And I think you can see that in the last 5 years it's become clear that a rejection of corporate power and corporate greed has become the common sense of the age. Now, Eric Hobsbawm, who of course died a few weeks ago, described in his last book 2008 and the crash of 2008, symbolized with the fall of Lehman Brothers, as the right-wing equivalent of the fall of the Berlin Wall of 1989. In other words, that the crisis of the political left that was encapsulated in the collapse of the Soviet Union and its allies has got its equivalent and its mirror, in a way, for the right wing and for right-wing politics in what's taken place in the last decade, and in particular in the crash and the crisis of the neoliberal model. And the objection that's made to that point, normally I would say, is that the left no longer has any systemic alternative. that it's not confident and not is no longer able to project a coherent socialist alternative in the way that has been the case in the past, that people don't have the confidence, as I was talking about earlier, to do so. And I'd say about that we have to, if you look at the last 100 years, that no political and social and economic model has ever come pre-cooked. Whether it was the Soviet-style socialism, or whether it was the Keynesian welfare model, or whether it was the Thatcherite, Reaganite, neoliberal model of how to run the economy and how to run society. None of those came pre-cooked, and they arose from ideologically driven improvisation in very specific historical circumstances. And I think that's going to be the same in the post-neoliberal crisis, in the period, in the aftermath of the crisis and breakdown of the New World Order and the neoliberal order. And that fundamentally the need to reconstruct a broken economy and society on a more democratic, egalitarian, rational basis is already starting to dictate the shape of a sustainable alternative. It's not going to be exactly the same as in the past. It's going to have new forms, even if the fundamental drive for social justice and class politics and a fundamental break with capitalism is going to be still at its heart. So the economic and the ecological crisis both demand, I would say, social ownership, public intervention, and a shift of wealth and power. I think that's clear, and clear to millions of people in a way that it hasn't been for decades, and that real life is pushing us in the direction of more progressive solutions. But how to turn that into reality is down to us and down to you. Thanks very much.
We've got about half an hour. Is that okay?
Of course, yeah.
Now for questions and discussion. I'm going to take questions in batches of 3 and then ask Seamus to come back on them. Yes.
Thanks, Seamus, for that. And I want to question you. Well, not question you. It's actually the dead man, Hobsbawm, who's now become a bit of a saint on the left. He was known as a pink professor in the 60s and 70s. And it's his analysis about the comparative between what happened in 1989 and what happened in 2008. Because, forgive me anybody who heard me say this on Sunday, but for me, the best thing about the demo on Saturday was a very small handmade placard. And it said, "Capitalism is working. It's meant to do this." And I think that, in fact, that's one of our big difficulties. The fact that the crisis has thrown up, for everybody is apparent, that, in fact, this is a crisis. But capitalism lives on crises. It has done always, And it's something that I think for many of us, it's true that we've got to carry on arguing about what the alternative's got to be. But for many people, they don't actually see any way forward. And I think it is that thing where I suppose my question...
Few points there in a way, because quite often the point you're making is made, that the one about how, of course, austerity is, it's not that it's not working, it's working for them. And I think those things are both true. I mean, it's like, in a way, capitalism or any social or economic system can't just, it has to operate in a way and gain legitimacy from being seen to work for society. If it's not seen to work for society and deliver for people, it loses ideological traction. And so I think so that's why I think the two sides of the argument really are two sides of a coin, not really opposed arguments. That it's perfectly true that it's in the interests of corporations, the wealthy and the ruling elite, the ruling class, that profitability be restored, that the crisis be resolved on their terms. That's perfectly true. But by doing that, and both by the fact that capitalism has so obviously crashed and led to crisis, is not delivering in its own terms, hasn't delivered actually in its own terms for a long time. This whole neoliberal period actually historically has been really very unsuccessful, even in its boom period, and especially in terms of inequality and stagnating living standards for working class people. I think the fact that it's not delivering is really a problem for it ideologically, and you can't really sell a system to people which says, yeah, but we're doing this so that we can restore profitability for the wealthy elite, and we're going to do it at the expense of your benefits and your wages and your jobs. I mean, that's not a big sell, is it? It's not a very successful argument. So I think the contradiction between those two things is quite sharp, which is one of the reasons why there is a huge political and ideological opportunity for challenge to that, and for a political and social alternative. And you're saying that also that people don't see a way forward, and I think that's exactly what I'm trying to focus on, in a way that we have to have more confidence from what's taken place, that we have to see the strength of our own arguments after a period previously which was a historical defeat. We have to see that, that's why I keep emphasizing this point, that we have been vindicated in really fundamental ways about the basic issues of our era, and that gives us a strength which we perhaps underplay quite a lot. The second point which you're raising in relation to not seeing a way forward is that is about movements and the weakness of the trade union movement compared with how it was in the 1970s and so on. So obviously that we've been living through that for a generation. But I think also that it's perfectly true that in advanced capitalist countries, trade unions are weaker, the working class has become more atomized, and all these things. That's perfectly the case. But it's also the case that there are still quite strong bastions of trade union organisation, and that those in fundamental ways. I mean, 6 million members in a society like a society like Britain is by far the biggest social organisations in the country, and actually historically in terms of trade unionism, it's true it's only half what it was in the 70s, but it's sort of what it was in the 1940s. So which people wouldn't necessarily see as a period of working class weakness. So I think if you link, you're talking about the new social movements and the relationship with the organised labour movement. Actually, those are pretty strong. I mean, it's not necessarily that well known that groups like Occupy and UK Uncut, are directly supported by, Unite, the biggest trade union in Britain. I think that's a really positive thing. I mean, there's not a single way forward in this situation. There is a whole ramp of different ways forward, which includes everything from Parliament to the workplace to social movements, to mass organisations, different kinds of campaigns, different new forms of organisation. There's not some magic bullet, but actually these things are quite positive, and we have traction with if you look at public opinion and public opinion polling, who most people in this country on many of the key social and economic issues, on public ownership, on the cuts, on privatisation, on the nature of the crisis, on the rich, on taxation, they agree with us. They don't agree with the main political parties, and so we need to find ways of exploiting that. But I'm generally more optimistic than a lot of people, because I think actually the ground for that is very fertile, and we're in a transitional period from the breakdown of an old kind of politics, and out of this period, out of this crisis, the conditions for something new and are growing all the time. And there are positive developments and inspirations all over the world, so as well as in this country. So I think that it's important to not so much focus on the sort of product of defeat, which is maybe some of the things that you're talking about and the aftermath of that, but really on what's pregnant in the new situation, which is what's emerging and developing now, and the fact that the process of transition is quite complicated and people don't know exactly where they're going some of the time. It's important not to miss the big picture, that we have been vindicated. Our arguments chime and cut with the grain of society and where it's going, and the needs of people, and the failure of the other side system and solutions.
Any other questions?
I was wondering if you see any kind of potential hope in Miliband's leadership of the Labour Party. I mean, at the time he was elected, I was pleased that he got chosen ahead of his brother, who I think...
The the first one was about the Labour Party and Ed Miliband. Now, I mean, I know some people on the left obviously have lots of different views about the Labour Party and how it should be approached. I mean, I personally think we should see all these things as arenas of struggle and contest, and that nothing should ever be evacuated. And I see the Labour Party as an important arena of political contest. Now, I mean, I think Ed Miliband's election, you know, despite all his history and where he came from in terms of New Labour and everything, was a significant event. And you know, almost the entire media elite was horrified. They treated it as an outrage. At the time, it was quite sort of startling. I mean, even I was in the hall when it was announced in the Labour Party conference, and there was a sort of shudder went through the sort of assembled, you know, sort of bigwigs of all different types, because that wasn't how it was supposed to have been. That was the wrong outcome, and it wasn't the outcome that they hadn't planned for, and it was not part of the script at all. Now, you don't want to exaggerate it. Obviously, you know, like I say, he's a product of his own experience and career throughout New Labour. But I think, you know, he was elected as a result of a revulsion against Iraq and against New Labour's support for neoliberal model and you know, banking deregulation and vast inequalities and stuff. And you know, the fact is, he did stand on a platform of you know, he did make a key part of his platform that that the old model had failed, and he's continued to stick with that in his own sort of roundabout sort of way. Now, and I think that's significant. Now, it's nevertheless quite modest, and you know, the Labour Party still you know, bears the hallmarks in every way of the New Labour period, the closing down of all forms of internal democracy, and you know, the squeezing out of the trade unions as a significant force, you know, the domination of you know, of many parts of the party by Blairites and so on. It continues to be the case. I mean, you know, effectively, Ed Miliband, even in his own modest progressive way, is very much a minority in his own shadow cabinet, and but in a way, I think his weaknesses really, apart from his own subjective weaknesses, his political weakness really is a reflection of that balance of power within the Labour Party and the wider Labour movement, and that really his weakness is our weakness. So what, you know, he's not going to do better, he's not going to be better, the Labour Party is not going to shift in a progressive direction without very, very strong pressure, because the pressure from the other side is absolutely massive. I mean, the pressure from the corporate, you know, from the media, from the corporations, from the City of London, on the Labour Party to toe the line, for example, on the issue of austerity and, you know, fiscal rectitude, is just huge. And you know, without a very, very intense countervailing pressure from the other side, that's the direction they're going to go in. There's no question about it. I mean, you know, the ground for it is already being laid. I think the important thing is not to evacuate that contest and that struggle. For example, right now, you know, there's a battle in the Labour Party leadership over the issue of the City of London and the banks. Now, Ed Balls is very much, you know, he's very much a product and still ideologically committed to the idea that the City of London is the goose that lives the golden eggs, and when it's fattened up again, you know, then they will then, as a Labour government, will redistribute a little bit some of the proceeds of that goose. And you know, I think he will not break with that politics. And you know, one of the issues it's boiled down to is whether or not Labour will be committed to a national investment bank, a state-owned national investment bank, which is very marginal, which would just do, you know, tinker at the edges of the economy and with small businesses, or whether, and you know, this is a battle that started at the TUC and the Labour Party conference, but it hasn't really been engaged with properly yet, whether the part nationalised banks like RBS and Lloyds are fully taken into public ownership and used as a motor of investment to change the direction of the economy, restructure it, drive growth, and you know, have a mass house building program and all that kind of stuff. And you know, Ed Balls is very opposed to that, and some other people are in support of it. But it needs pressure for that to shift. Otherwise, as Ed Balls said this autumn at the Labour Party conference, those two banks will be fattened up to be sold off back to the private sector, and the shifts that can take place out of the crisis in the way the economy is run, you know, won't happen. So I mean, I think it's, you know, it's a significant thing, but it mustn't be his leadership. But it will just end up in the obvious outcome, unless there is much more countervailing pressure on them. The second point that was raised was about intervention in Libya, whether that's really legitimised new, liberal intervention and imperialism. Personally, I don't think so. I mean, it's very interesting that, of course, people were confused about it, not just in here, but in the Arab world itself at the time, because they saw popular uprisings. They thought, that and they saw those uprisings being crushed, and so in Libya, people. It's not surprising people. When their backs against the wall, they call for foreign intervention, and people are sympathetic with them, despite what was clearly the case that imperialism, and Britain in particular, MI6 in particular, have been heavily involved in creating the conditions for the new leadership that emerged in the uprising. But I think the outcome of it and the bloodbath that it unleashed, that the intervention unleashed. I mean, for example, in the last month, in the bombardment of Sirte, where Gaddafi was killed, that was done under complete air protection and air power, NATO air power, while the town was systematically destroyed, like Grozny, with complete, disregard for all civilian and human life. I mean, 500 people were killed in the last week alone, according to Human Rights Watch people who were on the ground, and many of them were killed, were executed in cold blood. So. Now, people don't know all the details of that, but I think it's all around the world, and in the Arab world too. Most people are against the intervention. If you look at opinion polling in the Arab world, most people are opposed to it, whatever they felt about the uprising. And I think that's because they can see what happened. And I think the attitude to what's taking place in Syria and the battle over forms of foreign intervention and what it might take place has been shaped by what happened in Libya. So I'm a bit more optimistic about that too. I mean, I could see there was a danger of that re-legitimization, but I don't think it's happened. I think people in the region and around the world, they're extremely hostile to this kind of stuff, or at the very least skeptical about it. And I think that's obviously a very positive thing. About Latin America, how can it relate to us? I don't think there's a model, off-the-shelf model that we can take from Latin America. I mean, for example, in Venezuela, it wouldn't be possible for Hugo Chavez and the Venezuelan government to do what they're doing right now, this massive redistribution of resources towards the poor and the working class, the scale of social programs that they've carried through over the last 10 years, unless they had massive oil revenues. Or, if they didn't have the massive oil revenues, they would have to seriously squeeze and attack the interests of the wealthy in Venezuela, which they haven't really done, despite the fact that the rich in Venezuela scream and shout as you'd think that they were being, all being casted off to labor camps. Actually, if you go there, they're living very nicely in their wealthy areas, and they're really taxed pretty lightly. And I think, there's one of the Venezuelan ministers, he said in an interview with Owen Jones in The Independent, I thought it was quite a nice point. He said, because Owen was asking him, how come, when you haven't really bothered them very much, that they're so enraged by your government? He said, and this guy said, Timur Porras, he said, well, I think the real thing is that they can't stand the fact that their servants and their cleaners are now, running significant things in this country. They have political power here. That's what they can't abide. Not that their own interests have been so savagely attacked. They haven't. Although, of course, there have been very significant, nationalizations and public takeovers of more than 1,000 companies. So it's not that those things haven't happened. So some capitalists, obviously, in Venezuela have been significantly under attack, but they've mostly been compensated, although not all. But I mean, the point I would say about it is that because of those factors, especially the oil factor, and anyway, it's a process what's taking place in Venezuela and in the rest of Latin America. You can't just sort of transpose the model to over here and say, that's the future, we're going to do that. But what is very positive, and I think what we can learn from, are some of the elements that I mentioned, that some of these experiments in popular power, in democratic participation, at the local level, in the barrios, in the slum areas of Venezuela. They've got people, mass organizations are given control of public administration. Those things are things that we can learn from. Some of the social programs are really very progressive. These are radical governments across a whole range of issues, including gender issues, treatment of the disabled, all sorts of. Really, we're talking about a very radical process, as well as the basic things of the public control of resources, the public direction and democratic control of the economy, which is starting to take place. And so I think there is a lot of inspiration. It's important that people focus on what's going on there, but not to imagine that there's something that we can simply replicate over here. I agree with what Chris was saying about the big picture and the fact that we have to engage not just in day-to-day struggles and defensive struggles, but actually engage with the biggest issues that face people across this country and across the world. And I think that we are starting to do that, and we're able to do it in a way that that hasn't been the case for a long time. But it really is a question of confidence and really gaining conviction in our own alternatives and our own ideas, which I think are there in more than embryonic form. And the final point was about Hillsborough. Yeah, I agree about that. And of course, it's also the case, I don't know whether people have picked up on that, but that the same police force that was involved in the Hillsborough cover-up was also involved in the Orgreave scam, where there was a complete, as Liberty said at the time, there was a riot, but it was a police riot, and there was an attempt to fit up, scores and scores of miners, and one of the many legacies of positive legacies of the miners' strike was the overturning of that and the exposure of it, and the way the progressive movement, the left, came together to do that. All the lawyers who worked on it, all the the support of the trade unions to turn that round. And I think it's a demonstration, that across the board, we have many successes and many and have been able to expose many things. So I agree totally with the Hillsborough point and what it represents, and something to celebrate.
Any other questions? Any other questions? Or John?
Yeah, I'd like to thank you.
In a way, that what's happened, I think, is what you would expect to happen, that there's been a political polarization in Europe, in the Eurozone, and but actually what's really significant is that the radical left has suddenly got an electoral expression in a way that hasn't happened for a generation or more, and that's happened very quickly. The advance of the far right had happened before, really, and I think we should take encouragement from the fact that that's really what's happened in the last period. It doesn't seem to me terribly surprising that those expressions are a little bit equivocal still, in the sense that, if you're in Greece, these are really difficult decisions. About, for example, whether and how to leave the Eurozone, whether to default on the debt, and how to do that, and what the costs of that would be. I'm personally in favour of that, but I don't think we should underestimate how high the costs would be of doing that. And people in Greece can understand that. Of course, they can see very clearly that. And so I think Syriza's position is shaped by that underlying reality that the choices are very harsh, and the steps that would have to be taken would be very radical. That also there are all sorts of other political dimensions in Greece to the sense of breaking with the European Union, which is about their whole national identity and so. And I think that as the crisis continues in the Eurozone, which it clearly is going to do, and there will be further spasms and explosions in it in that crisis. These things are going to go further, and either Syriza or other forces like that are able to lead that process and take advantage of it, or they're not, and that's not a settled question. It's not written in the stars, but will depend on the way real events and struggles in Greece and elsewhere in Europe take place. But I think that process is already quite far advanced. The point about the banks, I do think that it is essential to carry out a full nationalisation. Some people say, well, they're already nationalised, but it matters from a legal point of view that there are still private minority shareholdings from what you can do with the banks. But also, the real point is how those banks are used. And this was the battle from the very beginning, when the Labour government took the big public stakes in the banks, that they were absolutely determined not to use them as nationalised banks, but rather to rebuild them for resale to the private sector. And I think it's an absolutely fundamental issue about what happens to those banks and how they're used. It's an opportunity we haven't, which has been thrown up by crisis, to have a public stake in the absolute core of finance, in the core of this economy, and to use it in a progressive way, and in an economically rational way. And that is an important battle. It's a battle that is sort of being fought out, but not nearly public enough, not nearly strong enough. I mean, actually, it's not only on the left that point is being made. It's. Mervyn King, has been, talking semi-privately about, the threat of a new banking crisis, the need for more public ownership in the banking system, and other non-left economists have been making that point as well. But I think you're absolutely right that the trade unions in particular, and I think they are doing this now, because what happened at the TUC, when for the first time in the history of the trade union movement in Britain, there was a resolution passed calling for full public ownership of the financial system, that case has to be now pushed very, very hard, and I think we are sort of cranking up to that. Last point on the riots. Riots do express fundamental social anger, and that's something that's happened throughout history, and I think the riots last year did express that. And actually, I thought they were quite. Despite the way they were portrayed at the time, there was a lot of very political expressions, certainly in particular, some areas, and particularly certainly in East London, but in other places as well, where people were expressing in quite a strong class-orientated way a hatred not only of the police but of the system. So it wasn't only negative what happened in the riots, and I think that those people clearly are part of of the people that need to be organised and need to find a political expression, a social organisation, and that's part of the challenge of our time. And it's not just a challenge here in Britain; it's a challenge throughout the world. It's like how do people organise when they're not in traditional workplaces, and that's. But it's also an opportunity. It's a huge opportunity to channel that anger and